12-speed drivetrains from SRAM and more recently Shimano are getting really popular, and they're only going to get more popular with mountain bikes. But E13 has a slightly different approach. They've released a wide-range 12-speed cassette, as well as some little components to upgrade your SRAM 11-speed shifter and derailleur to 12-speed, so it can take advantage of that 12-speed cassette. This kit is compatible with SRAM 11-speed shifters and mechs from GX level and up, so it doesn't include NX, and you'll need a SRAM XD driver. The cassette is also compatible with 12-speed setups from Shimano and SRAM, but the thing that makes this kit unique is the fact that you can upgrade your existing 11-speed shifter and derailleur to 12-speed. The cassette has a 9 to 46 tooth range, which works out at 511%. Now Shimano's 12-speed drivetrain has a 510%, so this is one more. Now I realise that 1% of 510% is actually less than a fifth of 1% gearing range, but it's one more, isn't it? It's worth noting though that the gearing is about 10% taller at both ends of the cassette, so you might want a 10% smaller chainring to compensate for that, to give you the same range of gearing that you would get with a SRAM or Shimano 12-speed setup. Impressively, the cassette weighs 337 grams. So for comparison, a SRAM XX1 cassette weighs 360 grams and a SRAM GX cassette weighs about 447 grams. The whole kit costs $299 or 299 euros, and that includes a cassette, a chain, gear cable inner and outer, and all the parts you need to upgrade your shifter and derailleur to 12-speed. On paper then, this seems like it could be quite a promising concept. A SRAM XX1 cassette alone will cost you considerably more than that, and the E13 cassette is lighter and has slightly more range. But the crux of this product is how hard it is to install, how hard it is to convert your 11-speed setup to 12-speed. The key thing with this product is that it should be simple enough to do yourself at home. We tried this with a SRAM GX shifter and derailleur. I found that once I had taken the shifter, derailleur and old cassette off of the bike, it took me about half an hour or so, but if you're a reasonably competent mechanic, it shouldn't take you too long, although there are a couple of tricky bits to watch out for. So on the XO1 shifters, you can remove this lever, and you have to do that in order to do the next step. But with this GX shifter, you just need to move this lever slightly out of the way like that. So set these bolts aside somewhere safe whilst holding the shifter together. Now on the other side of the shifter, there's a plastic cover, which you just have to carefully remove. Set that aside. While pinching this together, we're going to turn it around and install this tool, which is called the claw, underneath the shifter, like that. We're going to thread these bolts back into the shifter from the other side, into the claw, and that will hold it all together. We no longer have to clamp everything together by hand. Remove the spring. So we're just going to unscrew this, keeping the shifter pulled down towards the Torx key. And then you can take this mechanism off the shifter. We're going to replace the old 11-speed ratchet mechanism with the new E13 12-speed one. So I'm going to add some grease to this shifter mechanism, and then the washer should stick to that nicely. Then I'm going to install the ratchet mechanism onto the shifter such that this little window lines up with the spur on the shifter, which actuates the spool. Then I'm going to install the new E13 pivot bolt into the center of that. Now you need to make sure that the ratchet mechanism is in the most clockwise position. So if you press the downshift lever, that moves that mechanism out the way, and just make sure it's fully clockwise and then release, so that it should be on the last of the teeth. We just need to tighten everything back up with a T25 and the 4mm. Then when you just feel it become snug, just give it 90 degrees more. So now we can remove the claw, hold everything together with our hand again. Now we can reinstall the spring. That just hooks into this notch here. And then there's a little groove for it to get underneath, and then bend this round into that notch there. Now we can reinstall the inner cover, making sure that the very outer part of the coil is outside of this plastic bit here. Turn it over and thread the bolts back in here.
You'll notice that one of the screws is shorter than the other two. The shorter one goes nearest where the cable comes out. Install the new gear cable and then put the cover back on. And that's the shifter done.
So as you can see, there are a couple of fiddly bits. If you're a reasonably competent mechanic and you're happy to spend a bit of time getting your hands dirty, the installation process shouldn't put you off too much. Riding this setup feels almost identical in terms of shifting crispness to a SRAM 11-speed setup, except you've got one extra gear. One thing to note is that you will need to adjust your limit screws and the B tension on your derailleur to get it working properly. I took it up some steep technical climbs which involved some high tension shifting, and it never really dropped the ball there. I also rode it down some really rough and fast descents which involved some pedaling and shifting, and once again, no problems to report. I did find that when I removed the wheel and then reinstalled the wheel, the chain could get stuck between the jockey wheels and the cage of the derailleur because the jockey wheels are spaced away from that inner plate of the derailleur's cage. But I couldn't get it to do that while riding. That was only something that happened after installing a rear wheel. So I think this is more of a minor annoyance than a performance issue, but I have only taken it on one ride so far. So long-term durability and whether or not that happens if you hit even rougher terrain is still a question that I cannot answer at this point. I did notice that when shifting into the 9-tooth smallest sprocket and back again, it was sometimes a little bit sluggish, just took a tiny bit longer than the other shifts. And depending on where you set the cable tension, it was either sluggish going into or out of that smallest sprocket. But to be honest, it's not something that bothered me while riding. That 9-tooth smallest sprocket gives you such a tall gear that it's something you're only going to use a few times on a ride. And even when I did use it, it was only a tiny bit more reluctant than the other gears. If I wasn't out there testing, trying to catch the system out, I probably wouldn't notice, and it certainly wouldn't bother me in the real world. If you've already got a SRAM 11-speed drivetrain, which is in good condition, then I would say that this kit gives you similar shifting performance to, say, SRAM GX Eagle, but it's going to cost you much less. In fact, it's going to cost you less than SRAM's NX Eagle groupset. Whether it's as reliable in the long term as those drivetrains is another issue entirely. The other option if you have an 11-speed drivetrain and you want more gearing range is to get a wider range 11-speed cassette. E13 themselves actually make one which does a 9 to 46 tooth range, so the same range, but obviously you have some larger jumps between the gears. So maybe the most fundamental question to ask about this kit is, do you really need 12 speeds at all? But if you really want that extra gear, this kit does exactly that, and our first impressions are that it works as advertised. In terms of its first ride performance, it's really impressive. It works just like you'd hope it would. The shifting is as crisp as SRAM 11 speed, but you've got more range. We'll update you with a full review once we've had time to assess its long-term durability. So keep an eye out on BikeRadar.com and on this channel for that.